Welcome to Developing Student Leaders and Engaged Disciples for Destino. In this video, I want to explore the dynamics of and definitions for leaders and engaged disciples, and point out some cultural tripwires in developing both that you can avoid. An important clarification in the way Crew talks about leaders in our spiritual movements is that they must first be an engaged disciple. We determine that a student is an engaged disciple when they begin to, quote, intentionally engage non-believers, or at least one, in spiritual conversation. The heart is that they have gone from merely attending events and begin to look outside of themselves to pass on their faith. A leader is an engaged disciple that is leading a small group of win, build, send ministry. Examples of these groups in a Destino context could be a student leading a Dia de los Muertos outreach that requires a team of people to execute, or maybe a student-led discipleship group. The point is that you can't be a leader until you are an engaged disciple. Now there's a bit of a language trap here. The student who is coordinating meals or printing flyers for a Destino ministry could be called a leader, even if they are not an engaged disciple. This is just part of the messy reality of building spiritual movements. Sometimes, empowering a student with a role like this will actually get them to become an engaged disciple. Sometimes, empowering a student with a title like leader will get them to become what our definition is of an engaged disciple. So while it is okay to be flexible in how you use the term leader, make sure that you are really clear that in a spiritual movement, we ultimately define our leaders as those who are leading a small group of win, build, send ministry. Just as we pointed out in the previous video, the purpose of leadership in Destino is always to see more fruitful winning, building, and sending in our scope. If our leadership isn't producing that, or if our students' leadership isn't producing that, then even if it is culturally well received, then we are not exercising the kind of leadership that we're looking for. So the first step in developing student leaders in Destino is to develop engaged disciples. But in order to do that, we might need to think differently about discipleship. In traditional Crew, we tend to approach discipleship in a very dichotomizing and goal-oriented way. For example, we typically start with a lesson on assurance of salvation, move next to a lesson on experiencing God's forgiveness, and then move toward conversation about the spirit-filled life. Our discipleship moves in a linear direction where we have goals that our disciples will acquire specific knowledge at different points along the way. While there is nothing wrong with this approach, it does make discipleship a lot like climbing a ladder, or the image on the left. By implication, you move in a linear process toward a specific goal until you complete steps, which, in the case of Crew, usually involve demonstrating specific biblical knowledge. Compare this to what you see on the right. On a rope net, the process is not always linear to get to the top. You might approach scripture lessons with a less linear and a less knowledge-driven approach, and take things out of order based on the situation. Many disciplers in Destino embrace more of a rope net style of discipleship, in part because it helps create more space for a holistic approach, and it can be more relational and even less focused on achieving specific knowledge goals. Whatever approach you take, your goal is still the same. We're all trying to make disciples of Jesus, not of ourselves, who can become spiritual multipliers and leaders in a spiritual movement. We will talk more in future videos about ministry materials and best practices that can help you execute a rope net style of discipleship. Right now, I just want to encourage you to reflect a little on yourself as a discipler. We see in the Gospels that Jesus was able to call his disciples simply on the authority of his own word, and that men abandoned their livelihoods and their fishing nets and left everything just to follow him. Well, since you and I are not Jesus, we have to make some judgment calls about who we disciple and how we approach people. Thinking of yourself, how do you go about this process? I want to look at two judgments we commonly make in traditional Cru and how they might cause you to overlook disciples in an Hispanic or Latino setting here in the U.S. Judgments about being fat or faithful, available, and teachable, and judgments about maturity. I want to take some time to talk about group dynamics that might come up in discipleship. And then I want to look at some differences in how you might offer a discipleship challenge that's a little more contextualized for U.S. Hispanics and Latinos. First, let's talk about this common acronym known as FAT. Imagine this situation. You've been waiting for a student named Carlos to show up for a weekly discipleship appointment for 30 minutes. This is the fourth time in 4 weeks that he has been late. Carlos seemed like a good guy for you to invest in. He reads his Bible semi-regularly, he's pretty open about his sin struggles, and he's staying accountable. He even prayed for guys in his dorm and tried to get into spiritual conversations with them. But he is always late for everything, not just his weekly appointment with you. Carlos was supposed to bring flyers to the last weekly meeting so that students could hand them out in preparation for an outreach. He brought the flyers, but was so late that half the students attending had left by the time he arrived. How would you feel in this situation? It can be really easy for some staff to conclude that Carlos is not very faithful and that he is certainly not available. So perhaps he is the wrong person to invest in discipleship with. But consider, for just a moment, how cultural differences could be affecting your judgment in this instance. Of course, cultural differences might not be the only thing that's going on here. That's not what I'm trying to say. But, given our little mental exercise here, you would want to make sure that you have fully understood the cultural values that Carlos has before you make a moral judgment about him, such as he's not faithful. Make sure, for example, that you know that Carlos is not late because he has been sharing his faith. Likewise, you may need to consider how you might adjust your own approach with Carlos. For example, if Carlos's behavior is making you frustrated or causing you to be late yourself, these are things that you can largely deal with without making any judgments about Carlos. So, doing things like adjusting your own schedule, making more space for your next appointment before you meet with Carlos, or even just adjusting your own expectations might all be appropriate steps before making judgments. In the same way, other behaviors you might see in Hispanic and Latino students could cause you to misjudge them as immature. Again, this might especially be true if you come into Destino from a U.S. majority culture background. Of course, there is nothing in the Bible that says people need to be mature before we disciple them. But in reality, we are often looking down the field for those disciples we can also develop as leaders, since we have a particular spiritual movement in mind. And if we perceive someone is immature, we might actually overlook their discipleship potential and miss an opportunity. For example, if a student needs to ask permission from their mom to attend your weekend leadership event, this might not reflect maturity in majority culture, where we look for independence from our parents as a sign of maturity. Or we might judge that a student is immature when their communication to us is not clear. Well, perhaps we are actually the problem. Maybe we are simply missing their indirect cues. Or maybe we just forgot that English is their second language, and we fail to give them appropriate grace. Whatever the case, I just want to reinforce, don't let your judgments about a student's maturity be the only thing you look at when you are looking for people to disciple. It takes some practice and experience to learn how to avoid making these judgments. And for some of us, they come automatic because they're culturally conditioned. So if this is a concern for you, always keep in mind this is a great thing to bring up with your coach, especially if you begin wondering if your own students are, say, fat or mature. In Cru, we have a culture that thinks of discipleship as a one-on-one relationship. Even the process we use to challenge others to discipleship is a one-on-one conversation. Again, this isn't bad, but you might find that you create relational tensions in an Hispanic and Latino context with this highly individualistic approach. For example, you might invite a student into discipleship, but because you didn't also invite her friend or her sister, you find that both young women pull out of discipleship in the end. So instead, you might consider doing discipleship in groups. In fact, Destino seems to more commonly have non-believers involved in discipleship. Now, the idea, of course, isn't to erode our own purposes in discipleship. We're still trying to make disciples of Jesus who can be spiritual multipliers. All I'm saying is that in the right situation, this group approach with a little bit higher inclusivity can work better. Just make sure that you are clear about your intentions and that you create a space safe enough for a non-believer to be engaged in this situation. It has happened more than once in Destino that a group discipleship approach leads to a student accepting Christ after they agree to discipleship. I jokingly refer to this as the build, wind, send ministry. Sometimes it just happens that way because it's a little less linear, and there is nothing wrong with that. So here are a few ideas for how you can present a discipleship challenge in a Destino context. First, don't overdo the challenge. Consider calling it a discipleship invitation or something else that's a little bit friendlier. If your challenge is too strong, students might feel like they have not earned the proper status in Destino to take it on. Or else they might be afraid of it. Maybe it creates too much uncertainty than they can handle. You may need to emphasize that discipleship is a normal part of the Christian experience, and not some advanced elective for the super holy. This can actually be a great time to talk about being as spiritually empowered with a student in this broader sense of our cafe values. Second, emphasize that you are asking for a deeper relationship with the person or the people that you are issuing your discipleship invitation to. Of course, this is true, and it may seem obvious to you, but keep in mind it might not be so obvious to your potential disciples. Third, you might need to revisit your discipleship challenge more than once. That is, please don't assume that just because you had a good conversation about Matthew 28 and 2 Timothy chapter 2, that the other person is really bought in to discipleship. Oftentimes, students in Destino are likely to leave you with a little better impression of their own understanding than they actually have. Maybe because they really just want to save face. Fourth, as much as you can, make discipleship about experiencing God's grace, not just giving away information about it. Telling lots of personal stories, asking lots of questions, and involving others besides yourself in the discipleship process are all simple ways to do this. Your coach can help give you even more tips for how to do this as you grow as a discipler. One of the things you will notice about these tips is that it puts the emphasis more on you and your character as a discipler, and less on a specific curriculum or technique. This is not to say that discipleship curriculums are bad. It's just to point out that in a cross-cultural situation, you will almost always have to depend less on a curriculum or a technique to be successful. Why do I say this? Because I'm not the only one who said it. The idea is reinforced by missiologists, as it is here in the following quote. Missions agencies tend to be pragmatic problem solvers, seeking effective ways to motivate, enlist, organize, and replicate success in ministry. It is easy, however, for these ways to be reduced to techniques. More often than not, specific techniques do not fit other cultures. As disciplers, we need to remain self-critical about our own techniques, as well as honest about the reality that discipleship is a long-term process that can't be easily reduced to a few Bible lessons. To take Matthew 28 seriously, we might need to be willing to develop our own biblical character over time so that we don't substitute biblical truths for cultural norms, or inadvertently push our own agendas, or just default to our own convenience, or ignore the human needs of those that we disciple. At the same time, we can trust that God cares about his own Great Commission, and that he wants to see his children, like you and I, walk with him, and our disciples walk with him. And he wants to see his glory made known even more than we do. When you're certain, or relatively certain, that you have engaged disciples on your hands, developing student leaders will go much, much easier for you. If you're having trouble developing student leaders in a Destino movement, obviously you should talk to your coach. But the first thing you should investigate is how well you have done at developing engaged disciples. It is no coincidence that my tips for making a discipleship challenge hold true for making a leadership challenge in Destino as well. Don't overdo the challenge aspect of your leadership. Just like with the discipleship challenge, if your challenge is too strong, students might feel like they have not earned the proper status in Destino to take it on, or else they could be afraid of it, or else it could cause too much anxiety and overwhelm their systems. Again, emphasize the relationship, but be intentional about how you transition your relationship into a place of ministry coaching when you begin to develop leaders. You might find that taking a leadership profile assessment with your disciple and talking about the differences in your own leadership approaches will help you both to understand each other as you enter this new phase together. And avoid relationships of dependence by involving others in their discipleship process, such as an Hispanic or Latino mentor or a pastor. You still might need to revisit your leadership agreements more than once, especially at first. Just like with discipleship, students in Destino are likely to leave you with a better impression of their own understanding and maybe their own commitment to a leadership arrangement than they actually have, because they want to save face. Lastly, if you get an engaged disciple who is starting to lead in Win, Build, Send ministry, make sure that you help that person to maintain healthy boundaries. One way you can do this is by steering this person away from other responsibilities, like printing flyers and organizing food. It's not that these things are bad activities. Sometimes they want to do them, and I understand that. Still, do what you can to protect the integrity of your own leader's ministry, even if this means doing these activities yourself. Don't forget, you still want to encourage their academic achievement and financial responsibility, and not overload them with so much that they forget to grow in these other areas as well. So here are the resources I used and cited in making this video. Thanks for watching.